scenario in higher PE. Today we're going to talk about the scenario, which is section 3 of your exam, and it's usually worth 8 marks. The scenario usually focuses on 2 factors, and we know this year for 2022 that the 2 factors in question are going to be physical and emotional. In previous years, the scenario has featured a quote. It could be feedback from a coach to a performer. It could be a training diary entry. It could be a bar or a line graph. It could be picture with text, or it could be data collection results. And we know this year the SQA has told us that it's going to be a line graph, and it's going to focus on physical and emotional. So what we're going to do in this video is take you through 3 different examples of line graphs. Some key tips for answering the scenario questions. It's really important that you look at the information you're being given carefully, and you spend a bit of time highlighting or underlining the key points. Have a look at what it tells you, and then try and think about how can you use that information to answer the questions. Have a look at the questions carefully, and then try and plan your answers before starting writing. So on screen just now is example number 1 of a scenario, and it's a line graph. If you have a look at the y-axis going upwards towards the sky, we can see the performance level ranging from low, mid to high, and along the bottom we can see the number of weeks that they have carried out their personal development plan, and it's from 0 to 8 weeks. It's also important then to have a look at the trend of the graph. So I've annotated this for you so you can see here that the performance level is slowly increasing. Then there's a sudden decrease between week 3 and week 4. We then see an increase between week 4 and 5, and then we see another quite rapid increase between week 5 and week 6. And between week 6 and week 8, we see it plateauing or flatlining. It's also important here to look at the key. So we can see where there's a round dot, that was where the performer was given verbal feedback only. And where there's a little cross, that was where they got a mixture of combined feedback. So they got some written, some verbal, and some visual. It's also really important that you read this statement here. You must refer to the information in the graph in your answers. So here's what the first question looks like. Evaluate the effectiveness of different types of feedback on the development of physical factors for this performer. Now it's 2 marks, so we need to give 2 different examples. You could give a third example here because there's plenty to talk about from this graph. Now, because it's an evaluate question, we have to make sure that we are giving a judgment, and we want to probably talk about verbal feedback and give an example of where it was maybe effective or ineffective. And we also want to talk about combined feedback and give an example of where it was effective or where it was ineffective. So here is on screen just now on the left hand side is an example of 1 mark. The verbal feedback given is effective. Verbal feedback is given each week up to week 3, and we can see a steady increase in performance levels. So that's the first 3 weeks here. This suggests that the performer is getting advice from someone who is able to tell them what to do to keep improving. That could be from a coach. In weeks 6 to 8, the performance level is at its highest, so that's at the end of the graph. The graph illustrates that the performance level has hit a plateau. This points to verbal feedback being given, being positive and motivational, but perhaps not containing any useful feedback. This means that the performance level does not improve and the performance level stays the same. Combined feedback is given at week 4 at the lowest point of development. This could be because verbal feedback has lost its impact and it's now not constructive, or perhaps it's been quite negative, so the performer has lost motivation and doesn't know what to work on. And lastly, this starts to pick up towards week 6, which suggests that visual feedback with the verbal feedback is easier to see and understand what needs to be changed, so it gives a focus to practice. The written feedback here could also help the performer to remember from session to session. So there's some points of evaluation there. Really important that you make reference to the graph and you give a judgment. Moving on now to our second scenario. So on the right hand side here we can see a graph which shows the level of development on the y-axis, and on the x-axis again it shows the length of times during weeks. Now the graph shows us the physical development of a performer. The first question is the one that we're going to look at here. So using the information in the graph, analyse the impact of physical and mental factors may have on this trend. And it's worth 4 marks, so we need to give 4 examples. What I would try and do here is give 2 from the physical factor and 2 from the mental factor. But first, let's look at the trend of the graph. So in weeks 1 to 3, we see the performance level increasing. In weeks 3 to 4, we see it flatlining. And in weeks 4 to 5, we see it dropping. and then in weeks 5 to 7 we see it increasing. So again, I would draw on the paper or I would annotate the paper here either by highlighting or by circling. Now, this question is asking about mental and physical subfactors, so what we need to do here is try and list those subfactors and then think about ones that may have impact on this trend. And I've highlighted some ones in yellow that we might want to talk about here. Now remember, these subfactors can have a positive impact or they can have a negative impact. So ones that you maybe want to mention in your answer would be concentration, motivation, mental toughness, CRE, muscular endurance, consistency of skill, technique, and accuracy. So it's an analyse question, so what we're going to do is try and identify something, make reference to the graph, and try and pick out where one particular subfactor could have a positive or negative impact. Now remember, it's the three-step process we're going to do here, so we're then going to give the implication, what could this mean, and we're then going to say, what does this lead to? So, concentration can have a positive impact on performance in weeks 1 to 3, so we can see that the performance level is increasing. This could mean that the performer will be able to block out distractions and focus on improving their weakness every session at the start of their PDP. This leads to the performance level gradually increasing over the first 3 weeks. So that would get us 1 mark. We're going to look at a second example now. Motivation can have a negative impact on performance in weeks 4 to 5. This could mean that the performer is starting to get bored of their program as it is not varied, and this leads to the performance level decreasing. Now what I would ask you to do is to go away and try and write about where CRE could have a positive or negative impact looking at this graph, and where mental toughness could have a positive or negative impact looking at this graph to allow us to access all 4 marks. Moving on now to our third scenario, and this is one that I've created. As you can see here, it's a graph with 2 lines on it. The blue line shows us the performance level, and the orange line shows us a performer's confidence levels. Now, this is over a 10-week program, so we can see where they start in week 1 and where they end up in week 10. And they've been scoring themselves from 0 to 5. Now, if you were faced with something like this in your exam, what I would say to you to do again is to look at the information given to you in the graph. What does it display? What does it show? So we can see performance level, we can see confidence level, and then have a look at the trend of the line. So initially we can see an increase in confidence level, we can see an increase in the performance level. We then see quite a sharp decrease in the confidence level, then we see an increase, then we see a slight decrease. And again, with performance level, we see a slight decrease between 3 and 5. Between 5 and 7, we see a rapid increase in performance level. And then we see it slightly flatlining. So, are the lines similar? Are they different? Is there any conclusions that we can draw from that? So, the first question is asking us, a bit like the last question, to analyse the impact the physical and emotional factor may have on performance during this PDP. Again, what I would do here is think about, what are my physical subfactors? What are my emotional subfactors? Which ones would fit well with this question? Now remember, confidence is being shown on the graph and it's an emotional subfactor, so let's start with that one. So what we're going to do is we're going to give a specific example and relate this to the graph. We're then going to give the implication, so what could this mean? And then we're going to say, what does it lead to? We're going to give the impact that it has on the performance level. So here's an example of 1 mark. Lack of confidence may have a negative impact on performance in weeks 3 to 5. So we can see here that it's decreasing. This means if the performer is not confident, they may struggle to try their best during training sessions and maintain effort, particularly when they make mistakes or when they are tired. This leads to the performance level decreasing between 3 and 5 when confidence also decreases. Thank you very much for watching this video on the scenario questions. I hope you found it useful.